Hello and good evening from the UK. My name is Rob Fender. I'm a professor and head of astrophysics at the University of Oxford. Let me start by saying that I hope wherever you are and whatever your personal circumstances, you and your loved ones are well and coping as well as possible with the pandemic. Tonight, we're going to showcase some of the research going on at Oxford Astrophysics. I gather we have over 300, I see now over 350 people online, so I won't dawdle in this preamble, we'll get straight to the science. We will have 3 presentations tonight, followed by an opportunity for you to ask questions. Please do submit your questions using the Q&A button at any time during this webinar, and I see we already have a few in, and we'll try to get to as many as possible after the last talk. We have had specific requests for captions to be available. So if you prefer to disable them and don't know how, please refer to the email sent earlier today, which should have instructions on how to do that. And finally, just a reminder that this event is being recorded and will be available in our YouTube channel in the coming days. If you ask a question, your name will be visible, so please bear this in mind. Okay, so I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes describing Oxford Astrophysics before I get on to my own presentation, which is going to be about black holes in the universe. Oxford Astrophysics' home is this rather iconic building, the Dennis Wilkinson building, which sits in the centre of Oxford. In Oxford Astrophysics, we work on all aspects of astrophysics. We work in areas of theory, observation, and we also design and construct instrumentation for some of the world's largest facilities and biggest projects. We have over 200 astrophysicists working in the sub-department, and we are involved in large international projects across the globe, including leadership roles in many of these. The coming decade is going to be very exciting for Oxford Astrophysics. I show here just a timeline and associated facilities, some of the facilities which are going to be very exciting for Oxford Astrophysics over the coming decade. Plato and Ariel are space missions which are going to discover and characterize extrasolar planets. WEAVE is a fantastic success story. This is a multi-object spectrograph which was 15 years in the development and construction and which was completed during the pandemic in the Dennis Wilkinson building. At the turn of the year, was shipped out to the William Herschel telescope in the Canary Islands and is now in the final stages of being installed in preparation for first light. We are also developing the Harmony instrument, which will be a first light instrument for the European Extremely Large Telescope, which will be a 40-meter class optical telescope coming towards the end of this decade. We're also heavily involved in science exploitation and software development for the Euclid and JWST space missions, and also lead software development for some aspects of the Simons Observatory, which is a next generation cosmic microwave background experiment. The LSST, recently renamed as the Vera Rubin Observatory, will be completely transformational for optical astronomy in all areas, from cosmology to transients and stellar explosions. And then finally, we are heavily involved in radio astronomy. Many of us are heavily involved in the Meerkat radio telescope, which is a new facility operating in South Africa. And this will segue halfway through this decade into the first phase of the Square Kilometre Array, which is a major project for the global radio astronomy community in general, and for the UK in particular. Let me just say a little bit about the programme for tonight. So I will be talking shortly about black holes in the universe. I won't do the strange thing of introducing myself, but you can read a little bit of detail about myself there. Professors Jayne Birkby and Pedro Ferreira will give the following talks. Jayne is an expert on extrasolar planets and Pedro is a cosmologist, and I will give them proper introductions shortly before their talks. So let's crack on with the science. I'm going to tell you for the next 15 minutes or so about some of the research which we do at Oxford in the area of black holes. And this is something I work in personally myself and have done so for over 25 years now. So I should say first off that black holes really are the strangest unit objects in the universe. The most massive black holes that we know about are about the size of our solar system, and yet, at least in the description of classical general relativity, can be completely described by three numbers, one of which is nearly always zero. They're completely unlike any other macroscopic objects in the universe, and in fact share properties with subatomic fundamental particles, and yet have very large physical sizes. We think we understand the process whereby you can create a black hole, that is the collapse of a massive star, perhaps 30 to 60 times the mass of our own sun. And we believe, therefore, that there are many such relatively small black holes distributed throughout the universe. How the most massive black holes, the supermassive black holes, formed is as yet not entirely clear, and it may well have been in the early universe, pressure fluctuations allowed black holes to form very early on. In a black hole, all of the mass is concentrated at a single point, which again, in classical general relativity, we refer to as the singularity. And I've written here that this is impossibly dense, and in fact, it is so. It must be that we have some theory of quantum gravity taking over at this point, but we can't see it because the black hole is shrouded, or the singularity is shrouded from our view by this event horizon which surrounds it. Anything which passes the event horizon en route to the singularity is completely cut off from our part of the universe, and we can no longer receive any signals, including light, from that object. Nevertheless, black holes in the universe are not all dark. A lot of black holes in our universe on a range of mass scales actually have a lot of matter falling down towards them, and this is a process which we refer to as accretion. When this flow of matter is dense enough, then this material will tend to settle down into a thin disk, which we call an accretion disk, which gently lowers matter down into the gravitational potential of the black hole. As the matter is lowered down into this gravitational potential, it frees up its gravitational potential energy, and this results in heating of the matter. And the result of this is that the inner regions of the accretion disk glow very brightly in radiation. On top of this, however, there is another route by which energy is fed back from black holes. And this is illustrated in this artist's impression here by this blue straight feature coming out from the black hole on this side, and this red feature coming away here. Now, these are not so easily explained properties of black holes, which we refer to as jets, but we see that they are pretty ubiquitous in the universe, and that in fact pretty much all black holes actually have these powerful flows of matter and energy away from them. And I should of course state that these jets are not coming from inside the event horizon, but are somehow being generated by the very innermost regions of this accretion disk, when matter is orbiting at close to the speed of light. Now, the work which we do in Oxford on black holes, a large amount of it, and the work that I'm going to describe tonight, is done in the radio band, and I'm going to particularly highlight observations which have been made with the Meerkat radio telescope. So I show here a snapshot of some of the radio of the dishes of the Meerkat array in South Africa. There are 64 dishes in total, and the telescope was inaugurated 3 years ago, almost to the day, and it's turned out to be almost transformational for these studies. And the reason that we observe these black hole jets in the radio band is due to the peculiarities of the synchrotron emission process, which means that although you have very high energy particles, they actually emit at relatively long wavelengths, low energies. The image you see on the right is a sequence of images from a black hole in our own galaxy, which has the name SS433. Now you'll see a number counting up and then resetting here. Each number, the number represents the day number of a sequence of observations taken nearly continuously over a period of 42 days. And what you can clearly see is that the structure of this black hole and the environment around it is changing very dramatically on daytime scales. And the impression, in fact, the fact of matter and energy flowing away from the black hole is unmistakable. It's very hard to estimate the true energy budget of jets like this, but we know that in this case of SS433, the power in these jets, which are nearly continuous, is at least 100,000 times the total power output of our own sun. So we've been leading studies of black holes on all scales with Meerkat, and I'm going to talk you through in the next few slides some studies of distant supermassive black holes, of the black hole at the center of our own galaxy, and at some stellar mass black holes, the lowest mass black holes that we know of also within our own galaxy. So let me start with this image. This is an image from the MIGHTY project on the Meerkat radio telescope. And this is a project which is co-led from Oxford by Professor Matt Jarvis. Now, some of you will have seen astronomical images like this previously, which are in the optical band using traditional optical telescopes. And in that case, most of the point sources you would be seeing would be stars. This is an extremely deep radio image composed of more than 100 hours of Meerkat time. And nearly every single point you are seeing in this image is the radio emission from the jets from a distant supermassive black hole. And in fact, if you look closely at this image, you can see that many of these sources, in fact, appear to be distorted. And these are the larger of these jets from these supermassive black holes. If we zoomed in on one of these objects at higher resolution, then we would see something like this. And in this case, this is a well-known galaxy that's relatively nearby called M87. There is a supermassive black hole around where the red point is here, with about 10 billion times the mass of our own sun. And then we see coming away from this supermassive black hole a jet, and we see that it has energized particles on scales which are larger than the host galaxy of M87 itself. If we were to zoom in, or in fact, if we do zoom in at even higher angular resolution on M87, and now I'm zooming in by a factor of 10 million, then we see very close to the black hole. So we're now looking at scales which are only about 100 times larger than the event horizon of the black hole. And we can see that still on these scales, you see this collimated structure coming away from the black hole. So the comparison of these two images tells us that there is this collimated structure which is launched from this black hole, carrying a lot of energy, which persists in its shape over a scale of at least 10 million. And if we zoom in, of course, by another factor of 100, we get the famous image from the Event Horizon Telescope, which for the first time revealed that at the center of the bright accretion flow, there is a shadow which appears to tell us that the event horizon of the black hole is really there. Now, these jets from supermassive black holes, we believe, have regulated the growth of galaxies over cosmic time and have thereby shaped our cosmic environment. And that is simply because the kinetic energy they transport out beyond their galaxies heats up the gas that surrounds all of the galaxies, and in keeping it hot, stops it condensing down onto the galaxies and making them grow. Now, if we come a little bit closer to home, then we can look at the center of our own galaxy. So this is an absolutely spectacular image of the center of the region around the center of our galaxy, again, as taken by Meerkat, and in fact was used as the inauguration image for the Meerkat radio telescope 3 years ago. This image was produced by Ian Hayward, who is a senior researcher at Oxford. There is a supermassive black hole in our galaxy with a mass of about 3 or 4 million times the mass of our sun, so about 1,000 times lower mass than the one in M87 I was just showing you, and it resides in the region here. This region here is the galactic plane. You see a lot of these spectacular, somewhat symmetric regions around here, and these are old supernova remnants. These are remnants of stars which exploded probably about 100,000 years ago and have created shock waves in the interstellar medium. You can also see these very strange filamentary structures which tell us that there are strong magnetic fields and highly accelerated particles in the region of the inner regions of a galactic center, but we really actually don't have a good idea what those are. If we step back and zoom out a bit further, so now the region you were just looking at was this central rectangular box, we can see that actually the radio data provide us with evidence that large bubbles have been blown around the galactic center. An analysis of these bubbles tells us that an event lasting about 1 million years, which took place perhaps 500,000 years ago, injected a very large amount of energy into the region of space around our galactic center. And this, we're not entirely certain of the origin of this. It may have been jets from the black hole, or it may have been a sequence of supernova explosions. And I'll just highlight again, it's a real mystery to me, and I think to the whole community, what exactly are these long, thin filaments in this region. Now, finally, let me talk about the Meerkat Thundercat project, which is a project I myself co-lead with a partner at the University of Cape Town. Now, in this case, we're studying black holes which have masses of only about 5 or 10 times the mass of our own sun. There are an estimated 100 million of these so-called stellar mass black holes in our galaxy, and we can estimate this because we have some idea of the stellar evolution history of our own galaxy. About 0.01% of these 100 million stellar mass black holes are close enough to a binary companion that they actually accrete matter from the companion in a way which is analogous to the most supermassive black holes. In this case, the radio emission, or the processes that produce the jet, are actually transient and variable. The jets you see from the supermassive black holes last hundreds of thousands or up to tens of millions of years, but the radio emission we see from the jets from these stellar mass black holes actually last fairly short periods of time. So for the last 3 years, we've been monitoring our galaxy to get a census of black hole jet activity distributed throughout our galaxy. So you see here an animation, and this is a projection of our own galaxy, where the plane, the center of this diagram is the plane of our own galaxy. So this in the center is looking towards the direction of our galactic center. Every single one of these is a black hole or neutron star within our galaxy, and the size of the symbol tells you about the strength of the radio emission which is coming off from that source. So we see that our galaxy is a very active and dynamic place for jets from black holes, and these jets are continuously being launched, pushing out from the black hole and energizing particles in the interstellar medium. Now, as part of our observations with Thundercat, we tracked jets ejected from a particular black hole binary, which was discovered for the first time in 2018. And you can see a sequence of images here, which go from 90 days to 180 days after we had evidence that relativistic jets were launched from this source. Normally, jets from these black holes are only traced for a couple of days after they've been launched from these sources, and then they fade away from view. But the exquisite sensitivity of Meerkat allowed us to track these ejecta longer. And in doing so, we were able to see that these ejecta brightened and then decelerated as they interacted with the interstellar medium. And this may be the key to accurately measuring the power from these jets, and in that way, understanding the true energy budget around black holes. And the way this works is the following. So if you imagine that you have a blob of hot gas, which has a lot of kinetic energy because you've thrown it in a certain direction very fast. Once that blob has expanded a little bit, it will cool down, you'll no longer be able to see it, and you'll never have a good understanding of how much kinetic energy there was. However, the space between the stars is not a complete vacuum, and in fact, these ejecta run into the interstellar medium. It piles up in front of them, causing them to decelerate. This converts their kinetic energy to internal energy. And if we can actually track these ejecta as they come to a complete stop in the interstellar medium, then for the first time we can do what we call precision calorimetry. That is, we can measure the total energy which was in these ejecta and really understand the energy budget around black holes. So on my penultimate slide, I'm just going to show you some actual data. And this is data showing the tracked positions of jets from black holes with Meerkat and one other radio telescope over a period of several years from the moment of launch. And the y-axis here, so the x-axis is time, and the y-axis is the projected distance in centimeters from the central black hole. Now, if these ejecta never decelerated, then we would just see straight lines, and that's all that had been seen previously. But in fact, we are now seeing on multiple occasions with Meerkat, these objects, they are turning over in this graph, and they are coming to strong decelerations and ultimately a halt. So the turnover in this direction is telling us that we are measuring deceleration. This is going to be transformational for our ability to really understand how much energy is in these jets. Okay, let me wrap up talking about black holes. The take-home messages from my presentation here are that black holes are everywhere in our universe. They were formed very early on in the universe. There is a supermassive black hole, albeit a relatively low mass one, at the center of our galaxy doing very strange things. And there are lots of stellar mass black holes distributed throughout our galaxy. Our work at Oxford with Meerkat and other radio telescopes has allowed us to measure the extent to which the powerful kinetic feedback from the supermassive black holes has been shaping the cosmos for billions of years. It's allowed us a completely unprecedented view of the center of our galaxy, throwing up lots of puzzles. And I present for you again that bizarre image in the middle left panel there. And then views of relativistic ejections from relatively low mass black holes in our own galaxy may hold the key to properly measuring the power of jets from black holes. Okay, I will thank you very much for your attention. I'll remind you to please write down your questions and we'll try and come to these at the end. Our next speaker tonight is going to be Professor Jayne Birkby. Jayne is our newest faculty member at Oxford Astrophysics, and she's an associate professor of exoplanet planetary science. She received her PhD from the University of Cambridge in 2012 and has worked in the Netherlands, both in Leiden and Amsterdam, and is formerly a NASA Carl Sagan Fellow from Harvard University. Jayne is a pioneer of using very high resolution observations of exoplanets to study their atmospheres. She uses some of the world's largest telescopes and ultimately aims to use the extremely large telescopes later this decade to determine which of the nearest rocky exoplanets can, or perhaps even do already, support life. She's an ERC starting grant laureate, which supports her team at Oxford, and she leads the observational program for exoplanet atmospheric studies in the multidiscipline Oxford Network for Planets. And finally, let me thank Jayne for stepping in at the last moment for Suzanne Egren, who was not able to attend tonight. Suzanne, take it away.
Thank you, Rob. Okay, I'm just going to share my slides with you. Okay, everything looking good? Right, in that case, I will begin. So thank you everyone for joining. It's so wonderful to be able to talk to you about just a small snippet, in fact, of the many different areas of research that we have in Oxford Astrophysics and exoplanet research. So the subject of my talk today is towards other Earths. And I always like to start this thinking about other Earths by looking at home, by looking at Earth. So I just want you to take a minute to take in this image of Earth and think about the types of things we can observe about Earth if we were this far away from it, for example. So you can see it has color, it's blue, green, white, it has clouds, it has oceans and landmass, it's round, and we know that it's rotating. And if your screen is, if you're in a dark enough room, you might even be able to see around the very edge of the Earth is this thin blue line, which is our atmosphere. And it's very tiny compared to the size of the Earth, but even this small amount of atmosphere is something that we aim to detect as astronomers looking at exoplanets. So our search for another Earth started in the solar system, and what we found were several other rocky planets like Venus and Mars, and we found some gas giants like Jupiter and Saturn, and some ice giants like Neptune and Uranus. So we already know there's this diversity of planetary objects even within our own solar system. But I want you to think about our nearest neighbors, Venus and Mars, and let's think about what's happening there, because we think these are rocky planets and that they formed more or less in the same way, but they're really quite different. Let's have a look. This is Earth. Earth is very cozy to human beings and life. It's just the right temperature. Our atmosphere is made mostly of nitrogen, and there is oxygen and some carbon dioxide, and these signify that we have life on Earth. If we go slightly closer to the sun and we look at Venus, this is an image from the surface of Venus, and it's really, really different, despite being almost exactly the same size and mass as the Earth. It has this thick acidic atmosphere, sulfuric acid rain, lots of carbon dioxide, and it's far too hot for us. If we go the other way, slightly away from the sun, we find Mars. Mars is this really dry, arid desert compared to the Earth. It's fairly cold, and again, its atmosphere is mostly carbon dioxide. So somewhere along the line, there was a process that made the rocky planets of our solar system, but something else happened to make them so different in their surface conditions and the atmospheres that we see today. And there's a huge diversity in that, even within our own solar system. We want to know what else is out there. So we've been looking for exoplanets since the early 90s. And the most prolific method of finding exoplanets has been to use the transit method, which is what you're seeing here. So the planet passes in front of its star along our line of sight, and it causes a tiny fraction of the light from the star to be blocked. And we get this characteristic dip shape. That's about 1% or less. We have these two missions, Kepler and TESS, which is the Transiting Exoplanet Survey Satellite, that have done the lion's share of detection of exoplanets. And within Oxford, we've been involved at many different stages of finding exoplanets with these two missions, particularly in confirming their masses. This is where that's Susanne Glein and her group D. To date, as in exactly of today, we know of 4,424 exoplanets. Now, what I'm about to show you next shows you how common planets are given their size. And what we found, which was maybe unexpected in the end, given what we saw in the solar system, but what we found was quite unusual. So let's take a look. So here you're seeing, over on the right-hand side, this is where all the large exoplanets like Jupiter would be. And there aren't very many of them. If we go to the Earth-sized things, our survey sensitivity starts to drop a little bit here. So we're not completely sure what's happening here. But the really big surprise was this huge rise in the middle of objects that we've called super-Earths and mini-Neptunes. And as far as we know, to date, we do not know of any planet in our solar system that is a super-Earth or a mini-Neptune. So a planet that has the size and mass somewhere between that of Earth and Neptune. And yet these are common. We find them around at least a quarter of all stars, and they typically have orbits less than 100 days. So a year lasts less than 100 days. So what's going on here? What forms these and what are they like? One might want to use one's imagination, thinking about what would it be like to be on a super-Earth where gravity is really strong. We found these planets not just around sun-like stars, but even red dwarf stars. You might think about how does vegetation, which on Earth is green and that uses sunlight, if you're around a red star, the light is a different color. Maybe a plant has to change its pigments in order to be able to photosynthesize. Star Wars fans will be pleased to know that there are indeed planets out there with multiple host stars, so twin suns in their skies. We've even found systems of up to 6 stars in the sky for different exoplanets. And we have found systems with multiple planets in it, the TRAPPIST-1 system, which I'll talk more about later. So there's this incredible diversity of exoplanets, and we know their masses and sizes from the transit method and the follow-up that we do, but we probably want to know a bit more about them. And as of yet, we don't have machines that can take us directly to these planets yet. I think one day we will. But for now, what we do is remote sensing. We use telescopes on Earth or in orbit around Earth to look at the atmospheres of these planets to see what they're made of. Now, in order to do that, we need bright planets. And one of the things that has been happening here in Oxford is trying to find the very brightest systems to do this. Now, what I've shown you from Kepler is looked at quite faint stars, but in that survey, there are a few bright ones. And most of the planets have been found using computer algorithms, machine learning that goes and finds those little dips quite easily in some cases. But in many cases, you just can't match the power of the human eye. Humans are very good at pattern recognition. And in Oxford Astro, in the Planet Hunters TESS group, we've been using citizen science, so asking you, the public, to help us find exoplanets. And I want to show you the very latest discovery that came out just last month of finding a very bright system with 2 planets in it. So what I'm showing you here is the light curve. So you see, as time progresses, you'll see these characteristic dips appearing. We have a few pauses where the spacecraft wasn't operating, but you see these dips. And if we zoom in and fold up the data, you can see they really do form these nice transit shapes, less than 1% change in the flux brightness of the star we're looking at. And so this system was confirmed. This was Nora Eisner, who leads this program. She's one of our graduate students. And what she found here was a multi-planet system, the Neptune and a Saturn-sized object. It's very bright, so we want to try and follow these up and look at their atmospheres and understand more about what's going on with these systems. Now, going back to our terrestrial planets in our solar system, we've said their masses and radii are the same, and I've talked about looking at the atmospheres. Now, why do we want to do that? Well, the climates and atmospheres of these planets are quite different, and we want to take a spectrum of that atmosphere. Now, a spectrum just tells you how the flux of the light from the planet changes as a function of wavelength or color. And for Venus, for example, carbon dioxide has this big absorption feature at redder wavelengths. And in fact, we see something similar on Mars, but on Earth, the spectrum looks quite different. We have features from ozone and oxygen and water as well. And it's these signals that we're trying to find, these different molecules that might indicate to us some processes that potentially are biological in origin. In order to actually find these spectral features, we use the transit method. But what we do in order to actually determine what's happening in that spectrum is that we look at the light curve in different colors or different wavelengths. And as we do that, if we look at different layers of the atmosphere, you can see here that as we go from green out to yellow, the depth of the transit increases. If we do that for all the different colors, that tells us where those absorption lines are. We get more absorption, so the planet looks bigger for lots of absorption from very specific species. So this is the method that we use. And in Oxford, we're planning to use this with James Webb Space Telescope. This will be a 6.5 meter telescope that will launch in November this year. We're very excited about it. It's going to be extremely powerful for all astrophysics and particularly for exoplanet research. One of the key targets that we're keen to look at is this TRAPPIST-1 system. It's a laboratory almost of 7 Earth-sized planets, but you can see that the ones closest here in this artist impression, their atmospheres are probably quite steamy. They're a bit too hot. And further out, away from the star, things are cold, so their surfaces might be icy. But then in the middle, in what we call the potentially habitable zone, where we have liquid water, it might be just right, potentially, for life to exist. So these are one of the things that we're really excited about doing when the James Webb Space Telescope launches later this year. But we have not just been waiting around, we have been doing lots and lots of work from the ground using large ground-based telescopes. And one of the ones that I want to show you is looking at an ultra-hot Jupiter. So this is a Jupiter, but it's so close to its host star that it takes it only 3 days to orbit. So 1 year lasts just 3 days for this planet. And because it's so close to its host star, it's extremely hot. This is what we have found. So this work was led by Joost Waardenier. He's one of our graduate students. And he's found that this ultra-hot Jupiter is so hot that it's hotter than most stars. And then it's actually on its night side raining iron. It's raining molten iron from the clouds on its night side. Now this planet, because it's so close, it's tidally locked to its host star. That means it always keeps the same face to the star. So it has a permanent day side and a permanent night side. And at the terminator, so where you go from day to night, you get this sudden increase in temperature. And the effect is to lift and raise the clouds before they start to evaporate. And so you end up with this wall, this huge wall of clouds, which below it is raining molten iron. Joost also was able to tell from this work that there's a day to night wind extremely fast blowing from this highly irradiated day side all the way around to the night side. Now that's kind of incredible. I think that from this faraway planet and tiny amount of light that we can deduce all of this information. But how did Joost do this? Well, Joost used a technique that I've been working on since its inception and developing it to be able to do these types of things. And it's called high resolution spectroscopy. And let me explain why we need to use it. Exoplanets are really faint. They're typically at least 10,000 times fainter than their host star, and sometimes 1 million times fainter. It's a bit like trying to see a firefly hiding next to a lighthouse. You can imagine it's very difficult to see that little firefly in the glare of the lighthouse. So we need to extract the light from the exoplanet somehow. So we do this using high resolution spectroscopy. That simply means that if we look at the spectrum, it means that we're very finely sampling the wavelength. Now, the very best that we can do from Hubble Space Telescope If we were to do this technique, we would get a spectrum that looks like this. It's a single data point. It doesn't quite get the information that we need. Now, if we use our ground-based telescopes with 10,000 times more resolution, you'll see that a spectrum, for example, of carbon monoxide, what I'll show you here, actually looks like this. We have many, many lines and features in this spectrum. There's much information contained in each line here. It can tell us the composition of the atmosphere, but it can also tell us about its rotation and those winds that I was talking about. The way that we actually use this to disentangle the light of the planet is that we use the fact that the planet is moving very fast. As it goes around its orbit, its light is blue shifted towards us or red shifted away from us. And you might be familiar with this, the Doppler effect. You probably hear it if you hear an ambulance come past, the pitch goes up and then down as it moves away from you. And it's the same effect that we have with light. If you actually look at the spectrum, you'll see here in gray, that's the spectrum of the star, and actually looking through our own Earth's atmosphere as well. But the planet spectrum is moving. So we can use this movement to separate out the planet. And then because each line is so faint, we have to add them all together. But if we do that, we can actually figure out what's in the atmosphere. And in order to do that, we make models. And when we take that model, we exactly overlap it, and we sum it together. And so using this technique, this is work that I did back in 2013 now. This was actually the first robust detection of water vapor in an exoplanet atmosphere. So you can see this H2O here. And since then, many, many other molecules have been found. Now, these are all for giant planets like hot Jupiters, but with the extremely large telescopes, our simulations show us that we will need just 4 nights with the extremely large telescope to make an unambiguous detection of oxygen in the atmosphere of the nearest rocky exoplanets. Now, I say unambiguous because that spectrum that you see at such high resolution is so unique, and it's unique to every molecule, that it's hard for some random chance or noise to give us a spurious signal. So it's an extremely robust technique to use. And in Oxford, we're building the Harmony instrument, which will allow us to look in the wavelengths where we might expect to see oxygen. And I've also been working with the Metis team in Leiden, who are looking towards infrared wavelengths, where we'll be able to look for other biosignatures. And we expect first light somewhere in 2027. So really, we are the first humans to actually have the observational power to deduce whether or not the atmospheres of the very nearest rocky exoplanets have signs of life. And I think that's quite incredible that that will be something that we all get to see. Now, nature does not make life easy for us. Even though we could go looking for oxygen, oxygen is not just made by life. It can be made by geological processes or even by ultraviolet light splitting water atoms apart into hydrogen and oxygen. So H2O turns into oxygen and hydrogen. And so actually we can't just look at oxygen. We need to look for many biomarkers like water, carbon dioxide, and even methane. This comes from the stomachs of cows. And also a lack of other things like carbon monoxide. So we need to look at multiple biosignatures. And if that wasn't hard enough, there's other things happening as well. An exoplanet might have a very different host star to the sun. It might be extremely active. Now, Earth is protected from harmful radiation and flares by our magnetic field, or our magnetosphere. And work by our various different postdocs within our department, Belinda Nicholson has been looking at stellar activity and magnetic fields for stars to try and understand how they might behave and what they might do to exoplanets. Sarah Ruckheimer, our Gladstone Fellow, she's been looking at how the UV affects the spectral fingerprint of the planet. We might even want to think about this when it comes to life, that even without magnetic field, life can maybe protect itself. For example, you see this sea turtle here that uses biofluorescence. It temporarily changes its color to protect itself from harmful radiation. And in the case where everything goes terribly and we lose an atmosphere of this huge irradiation, Tim Lichtenberg has been working on the magma oceans of these lava belts that we would get where their surface is completely molten. And finally, just to remember, everything in the universe is rotating. But how do we make a map of a planet like this, given that what we see is this? So what you're seeing in the top right is the exoplanet Beta Pic B throughout its orbit, and it's just a pixel or two. But the shape of those spectral lines from that, we can determine the rotation of the planet or the length of its day. This one was about 8 hours. We even think we can actually make maps by looking at how the lines change very slightly. For example, when Jupiter's Great Red Spot comes into view, it changes the flux very, very slightly. This has been done for brown dwarfs, failed stars, but I'm working with my graduate student, Ben Sutleaf, to actually see how we can do this for the ELT. Okay, so with that, I'll leave you with my take-home messages, that we have techniques to determine the composition, the length of the day, the weather, the rain, the winds, and even map out exoplanets. With the ELTs, we'll be able to look for biosignatures, including oxygen, of the nearest rocky planets this decade, and that the Oxford Network for Planet combines not just astronomy, but biology, chemistry, geology to understand our place amongst this zoo of exoplanets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jayne. That was fantastic. Our final speaker this evening is going to be Professor Pedro Ferreira. Pedro is a professor of astrophysics at Oxford. He has a PhD in theoretical physics from Imperial College and worked at the University of California at Berkeley and at CERN in Geneva before joining the department in 2000. He is a cosmologist who has worked on the cosmic microwave background, dark energy, and dark matter. Over the past decade, he has focused on cosmological tests of general relativity, gravitational waves, and novel approaches for studying dark matter and dark energy. He is one of the founders and is now director of the Beecroft Institute of Particle Astrophysics and Cosmology at Oxford. He was awarded an advanced grant by the European Research Council in 2016 and is the author of The Perfect Theory, a biography of general relativity, which was shortlisted for the Winton Royal Society Science Book Prize in 2014. Take it away, Pedro.
Thank you, Rob. We are thrilled to be here to tell you about what we do. I'm going to tell you what keeps the cosmologists at Oxford awake at night and what we're doing about it. And I'm going to start off with a picture. This is a data set. This is a data set from the Planck satellite, the Planck mission, which they released in 2015, a mission flown by the European Space Agency, which we were heavily involved in. It's probably one of the most boring astronomical figures you could think of. It's a picture of noise on the sky. Let me go into a little bit more detail. You set up a detector which looks out and measures light with a wavelength of about 1 millimeter, and you measure the intensity of light coming at you from all directions. You take this image, which is on the celestial sphere, and you unfold it and you put it on a sheet of paper. The red dots are when the light is a little bit more intense. The blue dots are when the light is a little bit less intense. We often say that the red dots, they're hot spots, and the blue dots are cold spots. We know how to characterize this light very well. It's first of all, the dominant component is incredibly smooth, and it is possibly it is the most perfect thermal spectrum we've ever measured. It has a temperature of about 2.7 degrees Kelvin. On top of that smooth component, there are these very small fluctuations, very faint fluctuations. And to give you an idea of how faint, they're 1 part in 100,000. So you have these incredibly faint ripples, which is what we're seeing now, overlaid over this very smooth component. Now, what is this? I've described the data and how we get it, but what is this? This is what we call the cosmic microwave background. This is the relic radiation left over from when the universe was about 380,000 years old. 380,000 years seems a lot, but let's put that into perspective. We now believe the universe to be about 13.7 billion years old. So 380,000 years old is truly the infancy of the universe. So let's go back to this. This is a snapshot of the universe in its infancy. And for me, when I set out on my scientific journey about 30 years ago, we didn't have any of this. There was no measurements of these ripples. So I still find it stunning and moving that we have such an incredible data set that we can actually map out the universe in its infancy with this detail. Now, this is all very beautiful, but what does this tell us? It turns out that this data set tells us a hell of a lot. By looking at the distribution of the hot spots and the cold spots, the size of the hot spots and the size of the cold spots, how they're spread out, how much structure there is on all scales, This data set tells us things about what the geometry of the universe is, how fast it's expanding, what the universe is made of, what the beginning of the universe was like. It can even tell us things about particle physics. It can tell us, for example, how many families of neutrinos there are and if these neutrinos are massive or not. So all of this we learned from the snapshot of the universe in its infancy, when it was 380,000 years old. But you can do a similar thing today. So this is a completely different data set. Here, what you're doing is you're looking up at the sky, and whenever you see a galaxy, you mark it on the celestial sphere. All right. And so if you see a galaxy, you put a white dot on the celestial sphere. And you look at this and you do this millions and millions and millions of times. And slowly you build up this tapestry of light. And this tapestry of light is also highly structured and highly informative. So you'll have accumulations of white dots over here, which are clusters of galaxies and superclusters of galaxies over here and over here. These clusters of galaxies may be interlinked with each other via filaments or walls. And in the middle of these filaments, in between these filaments and walls, you'll have these voids. You'll have these regions of emptiness. In other words, the large-scale structure of the universe, traced out by galaxies, forms what we've called the cosmic web. And so this is the snapshot of the universe today. And by looking at the cosmic web in the same way that we look at the cosmic microwave background, by just reading into this structure, this can tell us a lot about the geometry of the universe, how the universe is built up, how the universe has evolved. We can go further. We have this snapshot of the universe when it was 380,000 years old, and we have the snapshot of the universe now, and we can link them together. And to do that, we have to come up with a mathematical model. The mathematical model that we have is based on textbook physics, the physics that explains everyday life. Classical mechanics, electromagnetism, thermodynamics, quantum physics, general relativity. You put it all together and you end up with a remarkably simple model. And the model is this: the universe exists, it's expanding, it was very hot in the past, at very early times it was ionized. When at some point the electrons and protons came together to form neutral hydrogen, it became transparent and neutral. The hydrogen atoms came together to form stars. The stars came together to form galaxies and generated the cosmic web that we see today. And all of this is explained in terms of the physics that we understand and the physics that we use to explain everything else around us. Now, this isn't strictly true. If you look at the model that we construct using the physics of everyday life, we find there are some inconsistencies. And it turns out if we want to make the model completely robust, we need to add some things in. And the things that we need to add in are, we need to understand what happens at very early times. We need something that will generate the ripples that we see in the cosmic microwave background, which then map onto the cosmic web. And there are a number of theories. That the most successful theory at the moment is inflation, but we do not know yet what is inflation, i.e. what causes inflation. I said that stars come together to form galaxies, but if we just let that happen, we wouldn't form galaxies. Galaxies would be too brittle, they would fly apart. We need something to keep galaxies together. And at the moment, the thing that best describes what is happening is some form of stuff we call dark matter, which doesn't emit light, but which clumps under its gravitational, under the gravitational force. Finally, the cosmic web, the cosmic microwave background, they're all pointing to a universe which is expanding more quickly than we expect. And again, the only way to understand that is if there's something else out there, some form of dark energy, some form of energy which is pushing space-time apart, which doesn't cluster, but has a gravitational effect pushing it apart. So we have what I call the cosmic chasm. We have a theory of everything, which basically explains pretty much everything around us. But we have these extra bits that cosmology has shown and consistently shown are there, which the current theory that we have doesn't explain. We need to bridge this somehow. We need to find some way of going from the physics of the everyday to the physics that explains cosmology. And so how do we do this? Well, there are really two approaches. There's kind of the sensible approach, and the sensible approach is to carry on doing what we've been doing, which is to map out the large-scale structure of the universe with better precision. It's given us so much information, it has much more information to give us. So for example, if we were to look at the cosmic microwave background, we want to build better instruments. This is on this plot, we have here the sensitivity of cosmic microwave background experiments along time. And what we see is they're becoming more sensitive over time. This is in the 2000s. This is the WMAP satellite, which gave us a beautiful map. The Planck satellite is in the 2010s, gave us the map that I just showed you. And we just need to push forward and do better. And to push forward and do better, we need to have better detectors, and we need to have more detectors. We need to be able to pack lots of detectors on a focal plane. So a particular example is the Simons Observatory, which one of my colleagues, David Alonso, is heavily involved in at Oxford. This detector the instrument is going to be built in the Atacama Desert. This instrument will have 100,000 detectors and will be able to cover half the sky and produce maps which are much more precise than the Planck map that I showed you. If I want to make a map of the universe today, we need to build a telescope that will do two things. First of all, the overarching thing you want to do is you want to map out more of the cosmic web, which means you want to see more galaxies. To see more galaxies, you need to be able to see fainter galaxies. In other words, you want to push up in this direction on the y-axis. You see fainter galaxies, you'll pick up more galaxies, and you'll see galaxies which are further away. You also want to pick up more area of the sky. So you want to push in this direction along the x-axis. So in other words, you want to end up in this area of this plot. Now, the Vera Rubin Observatory, which is currently under construction, again in Chile, it's also known as the LSST, is a really remarkable instrument. It's going to be the biggest digital camera ever built. It's going to have 13.2 billion pixels, and it'll map out the positions of about 10 billion galaxies. Now, 10 billion galaxies are basically all the galaxies that you can see out to a distance of about 3 billion light years. So in doing that, you'll end up with an immense map of the cosmic web. So cosmic web, a brilliant map of the cosmic web, a brilliant map of the cosmic microwave background will allow us to really drill down and understand better and better about inflation, dark matter, and dark energy. But I think we're at the point where we have to be a little bit realistic, and we have to prepare for the worst. And it might just be that we drill down and we see better and better, and we end up with remarkable constraints on how much inflation there is, how much dark matter there is, and how much dark energy there is, but we won't actually know what these things are. And that is a possibility. The hope is that won't happen, but that is a possibility. And so for a number of years at the Beecroft Institute here at Oxford, we've been thinking of other things we can do, new approaches. And it really is, you have to deploy you have to be clever. You have to think on the theoretical front, are there any new ideas that might explain these things? But you also have to think of how you might look for these things, either in existing data or future data, or what kind of experiments you might build, which haven't been thought of before. I'm going to describe two of many approaches that we've been looking at. The first thing I'm going to do is look at galaxies. Now, when I told you about the cosmic web and building up a map of the cosmic web, I basically said galaxies were these points that I dotted on the sky, and we looked at the structure that these galaxies form on the sky. But galaxies aren't like that at all. This is a rogues gallery of galaxies from the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. And you look at them, and on the one hand, there are similarities, there are blobs, but they all look a little bit different. They're quite complex and messy objects where a lot of physical processes are at play. They're very messy objects. They're so messy that people haven't really considered them as good places to look at for trying to test fundamental physics. On the other hand, with the surveys that we're deploying at the moment, we are going to end up with phenomenal images. We're going to end up with many millions, many tens or hundreds of millions of beautiful images of galaxies. So we're going to have this data set with images of galaxies, and we've got to do something with them. So we just have to be brave. We have to look at these messy systems, and we have to do two things. We have to come up with clever ways of simulating them. We have to think of ways in which we simulate them in ways that we include the physics that we do know exists and how we can factor in the physics that we might not know. So this will have to be clever about simulating. But as interesting, we have to come up with ways of analyzing them. And this is really, I think, one of the exciting things that's happening over currently happening. We're beginning to become brave about analyzing messy systems. There are new methods using Bayesian techniques to try and factor in the messy stuff, the physical processes we know and the physical processes that we don't know. But also there's, as you know, this wave of revolution in machine learning and artificial intelligence, which allows you to look at systems which you don't completely understand and start to extract extract information in ways that you never thought was possible. So I think this is really a promising, exciting way to move forward and really move forward in trying to solve these cosmological or answer these cosmological problems. Another example is to look at completely different systems. This is a plot, a sketch by Kip Thorne in the 1970s of what happens when two spinning black holes come together, merge. They're spinning, they merge, and they combine to form a black hole. And he surmised that you would have a train of gravitational waves, which would look something like this. Now, this is a sketch from the 1970s, and as you know, a few years ago, we actually detected these gravitational waves with a LIGO instrument, and it looks very much like what Kip Thorne guessed they would be. Kip Thorne ended up winning the Nobel Prize for this discovery. And the beauty of this is that you look at this signal from gravitational waves and you can reconstruct what happened. You can look at them and you can infer the masses of the black holes, how they came together, and their properties. But I think you can go a step further. You have these black holes living in a universe which is full of this stuff, dark energy and dark matter. And these black holes are quite extreme objects. They'll do something to the dark matter and dark energy. They'll accrete them, they'll accumulate. It'll start, this stuff, this exotic stuff will pile up around them. So this is a simulation by one of my graduate students, Jamie Bamber, where he's looking at what happens to dark matter as it piles up around a rotating black hole. And what you see is that you form these lobes and you form these structures. And so something, quite significant happens. So you can ask the question, you have these black holes, there's this stuff piling up. Will this stuff affect the way that black holes produce gravitational waves? And the reverse is, you have a signal like this, can you dig down into this signal and see if you find any evidence for the existence of dark matter and for the type of dark matter, the nature of the dark matter which exists in the universe? So these are two examples of very different approaches for looking for dark matter and dark energy. There are other approaches which Oxford is leading, which is building new experiments, which are very unconventional but very promising. So I'm going to conclude with the following. I'm going to say we have an incredibly successful theory of fundamental physics. It's the textbook physics, the physics that you learn when you study physics. And it basically explains almost everything. It explains almost everything except there are these details in cosmology. And cosmology has shown that it is incomplete. There are these open questions, and I mentioned the three main questions: how the universe began, the dark matter, and dark energy. And so I've called this the cosmic chasm between what we know and what we need to know to completely understand physics. There are two approaches. The first is to map out the universe with exquisite precision, with exquisite detail, map out the cosmic web and the cosmic microwave background. This means look harder, build better, and we're very much involved in doing that. But I also think it means thinking differently. We need to really change the way we think, because mapping out the universe with exquisite precision might teach us a lot, but it might not answer the questions that we want to answer, which is, what are these things? And to think differently, we need new explanations. We need to come up with new ways of analyzing existing and future data. And we need to think of different experiments which would probe the universe in a different way. Now, I have an essay on eon.co, which basically is a more extended presentation or more extended explanation of what I've gone into there. And I welcome you to go and visit this site, but I will stop there.
Thank you, Pedro. That was fantastic. If I could ask you to remain online and with your video on, and Jayne, can you also join us? Thank you very much indeed. So we are now going to take some questions. So I think we've all been, or at least Jayne and I have been trawling through the large number of questions in the Q&A part. So why don't I start, since my presentation was first? I'll answer a couple that I've picked out, and then we can move on to Jayne and then on to Pedro. So Pranav and Jade have between them asked these questions. What is the best theory to explain jets? How is it inferred that their emission is synchrotron? And is this the same thing that is produced in particle accelerators at places like RAL? So to answer the final part first, yes, it is. In fact, we see in space, we see both synchrotron and cyclotron radiation, but as you might guess from their names, these are actually names which we invented for accelerators we created on Earth. So in fact, a synchrotron is a device we use on Earth to accelerate particles, and we have one at RAL, and it's the same process that produces the light as we see in these astrophysical sources. What is the best theory to explain jets? Now, we don't really know how these jets are formed, but the best candidate at present is that as this matter flows in this accretion disk towards the black hole, so the black hole, well, the black hole is basically where my head is, and the matter is flowing in the accretion disk. The accretion disk is rotating increasingly rapidly as you get towards the black hole. If the accretion disk is dragging in magnetic field lines with it, that is, either a magnetic field has been generated in the accretion flow or has just been brought from whatever the reservoir of gas feeding the black hole is, then these magnetic field lines will end up being spun very, very rapidly as you approach the black hole. Particles, particularly charged particles, trapped on these field lines, some fraction of these will actually essentially get flung out of the system by these extremely rapidly rotating magnetic field lines. This is our best idea at the moment as to how these jets are formed, but it's not going to be one of those things. It's like the weather. It's not going to be one of those things where someone one day is going to go, aha, that's it, and write down an equation. And in fact, our best way of understanding this is to run complicated, general relativistic, hydrodynamic simulations on supercomputers. And then in those simulations, we see a kind of emergent property of these jets arising. Anonymous asked me, have black holes ever merged within our own galaxy? Well, the answer is almost certainly yes. However, we haven't observed that yet. So LIGO and Virgo have between them seen the mergers of, since 2015, of about 20 black hole systems and a couple of neutron star systems. All of these so far have happened in distant galaxies. And the reason for this is simply that the rate of this happening per galaxy is actually going to be pretty low. So the chances of us seeing one in our own galaxy are relatively slim, but you know, these things do happen and they will happen again. And finally, before I allow Jayne to take over with exoplanet questions, I have a question from Vladimir, who asks, what is the mean duration of a jet from black holes? This is a very good question. And this is something which actually is very hard to study with these jets from the supermassive black holes. These structures are thousands of light years across. Our best estimates of the duration or the period of time it took to form these large scale jets is that it was perhaps between 100,000 and 10 million years. But in most cases for these supermassive black holes, we can't really track the process or the duration of the jets forming. However, the timescales associated with a black hole scale with the mass of a black hole. So if we see something which takes 10 million years in a black hole of, let's say, 10 million or 100 million solar masses, then when we look at the stellar mass black holes in our own galaxy that have masses of only about 10 times the mass of our sun, we can actually track these durations and we can directly see for how long a period a strong jet was being produced. We've done this multiple times and we see that jets are essentially, in most sources, are strongly on for a period of maybe a couple of months every few years. And in fact, it's a little bit more subtle than that. There tends to be about one day. There's a specific point where the jets become very powerful, and that's surrounded by a period when the jets are moderately powerful. And then there are long periods of several years of quiescent activity. So thank you for those questions. If we have time, we'll come back to more black hole questions, but now I'll let Jayne answer some exoplanet questions.
Thanks, Rob. So yeah, really great questions in the chat for exoplanets. So the first one was an anonymous one, but it asked about, can a planet lose its atmosphere, and if so, how? So I mentioned these magma oceans and lava planets, and these are planets that are really close to their host stars. And so the atmosphere has actually been completely stripped away from the radiation of the host star. But I want to point out, losing one's atmosphere is not necessarily a bad thing. Earth actually lost its first atmosphere. So when it formed in a disk around the host star, the sun, it accreted gas from that nebula. That was mostly hydrogen, but the Earth doesn't have enough mass to hold on to hydrogen molecules and atoms, and so they float off into space. So we lost most of our first atmosphere, and actually our atmosphere today is what we call a secondary atmosphere. Most of that came from outgassing from volcanoes, and so that's how we have our atmosphere today. So it's not always a bad thing, it just depends on where in your orbit you actually are. Okay, so the next question was from Jade, and she asked, why do ground-based telescopes have higher resolution than Hubble, the Hubble Space Telescope, and will JWST have even higher resolution? That's a really great question, Jade. The reason that we can do better from the ground is because the higher resolution you go, generally, the bigger your instrument needs to be. And at some point it gets too heavy and too big to launch. And so that's why on the ground, we can have these huge telescopes with these, 39-meter mirrors and high resolution versus what we can launch. The JWST will have better resolution than Hubble, but it won't match what we can do from the ground just yet. But I would love to put a high resolution spectrograph in space. Ian Hawker asked, what is the role of artificial intelligence in understanding large quantities of data, and can it spot unexpected patterns? So I sort of took this in an exoplanet sense, because I mentioned sort of machine learning. And with artificial intelligence, it relies on a training data set. And from that, it can then tell you partly what you're looking for, and it can tell you what's unexpected. So I think there is a big role for artificial intelligence to play in exoplanet data, particularly as we go forward with JWST, the ELTs, and we have these huge volumes of data to deal with as well. So it's quite exciting to see what comes out of that, particularly for modelling what's in the atmospheres. We had two questions on a similar theme from Aisling Singer and Robert Sullivan, asking about, can we detect waste products of life? So for example, CO2 is one of our waste products, but also atmospheric pollutants. And indeed, with high resolution spectroscopy, if you can look at the unique spectral fingerprint of some pollutant, if there's enough of it for your instrument to be able to detect, then in principle, yes, you could detect that. So there have been papers written on trying to detect very polluting societies on other worlds. I'll answer two more, Rob. Hege Akusoi asked, what findings am I looking forward to possibly obtain by the next Venus probes? These are the Da Vinci Plus and Veritas missions. So these were recently announced, and there's also a further one from ESA as well. So we'll have 3 missions going to Venus. And I think this is extremely timely. And it's very exciting to learn what is going on in Venus, because it's so similar to the Earth that we need to understand what happened to Venus. And what does that mean for Earth? Is that something that could happen for us? So I'm excited to learn about what's in this atmosphere and its potentially tectonic plates and its sort of geological activity, its volcanoes. So very much looking forward to what's happening there. And then the final question from Nick Rammel, who asks, if you were to launch a space probe today, what exoplanet system would you go to? And how long do you think it will be before we can confidently identify a habitable planet to send such a probe to? I'll answer the second one first. I think we're quite some way off. So our very nearest exoplanet is Proxima b. That's about 4 light years away. So it means at light speed, it would take us 4 years to get there. So I think that's probably going to be the only one we can do realistically for the near future, unless we find some incredible technology. But I think actually Proxima b would be the planet I would send it to. It's our nearest rocky exoplanet. And I think if we're going to try and go to one, that would be the one I would pick, even though it has this red end-dwarf host star, which is potentially really active and maybe has stripped to the atmosphere. We don't know yet. And so we need to do the work with the extremely large telescope first. And if it all looks good, then it's over to the engineers to get us there. Okay, Rob, I'll hand over.
Perfect, Jayne. Thank you very much. Pedro, questions on cosmology.
Okay, so I've got a few questions here. First of all, Robert Sullivan asked, might there be particles or fields that don't interact with light? Well, it seems very much so. This stuff that I'm talking about, the dark matter and dark energy, we don't see it through electromagnetic waves. We don't see it. We don't see it. So the explanations that we've come up with over the last 50 years or 40 years is that it doesn't interact with light. So that's an answer. I mean, one of the most popular candidates for dark matter is a particle which has no interaction with light, which follows on to Jim Kernahan, who asked, what is the current best theory on what dark matter and dark energy are? Well, so for many decades, the favorite candidate for dark matter is a supersymmetric particle called a WIMP. As we improve our measurements and as we drill down observations, we are not seeing it. And so I think we are going through a transformational period where we have to start looking at other candidates. There are various proposals, but there is no favorite at the moment. So I think it's, it's wide open, to be honest. With regards to dark energy, The favorite explanation is something called the cosmological constant, which is something Einstein posited when he first constructed general relativity, or when he first constructed his cosmology from general relativity. The cosmological constant has quite a lot of problems. It's very difficult to fit it in without it creating problems elsewhere. So there are other proposals, but I would say there is no favorite model of dark energy. And this is why I think there is this cosmic chasm. We have no idea what these things are, and we really need something revolutionary to tell us where to look and how to look. Rittik asks, dark energy would have been involved in earlier stages also. How do we determine that dark energy does not cause inflation? Well, the problem with dark energy is that with inflation is that you need something to make the universe expand in a certain way, and then it needs to decay away completely and regenerate the universe. So if you wanted that thing to push the universe to inflate at early times, dissipate away and fill up the universe, and then come into being again, that is quite complicated. Of course, there are models that do that, but they're quite contrived. Mariam asked, do you consider Hubble's methods of finding the age of the universe to be outdated? Is it possible to investigate and achieve an even truer value of the age? Well, actually, this is what is going on at the moment. There are multiple ways of measuring the Hubble constant. And by measuring the Hubble constant, we can then infer through a model what the age of the universe is. We're in an interesting period where there are discrepancies in the Hubble constant that we get, depending on the ways that we infer it. And so there are the descendants of Hubble's methods get one way. Using cosmological data, we get another value, and we're going through a period of tension where this tension might mean something deep, or it might be that we are just not analyzing the data accurately enough. Patrick Butterley asks, does the universe have a flat geometry? If so, why? So the answer to the first bit is easy. Yes, it does. For the last 20 years, we've pretty much realized that the geometry of the universe is Euclidean, and I think that's what you mean by flat. It's not hyperspherical or hyperbolic. It's Euclidean. It's the geometry that we learn in high school, where the sum of the angles of a triangle are 180 degrees. If you ask, if so, why? No one has a clue. There is no fundamental theory of why the geometry of the universe is flat, apart from the fact that if it wasn't flat, we'd think that it would look very different from what it looks like today. If it was just a little bit off flat in the distant past, it would look very much off flat now. So the only way we can solve that fine-tuning problem is to assume that it's perfectly flat. Finally, Satya Narayanan asks, why does the universe have a web-like structure specifically rather than any other structure? Really fascinating question. It has to do with the gravitational force. If you do an exercise, forget general relativity, lay down a box of particles and just distribute the particles randomly and let them evolve. What you find is that these particles will tend to clump. They'll form clumps, and so they'll form concentrations, but then these concentrations will be connected through filaments, and these filaments might themselves be connected through walls. So you end up with these blobs with filaments and walls and the empty part in between. It'll look like a cosmic web. Anyway, I think I'll end there.
Thank you, Pedro, and thank you again, both Pedro and Jayne. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up there. I'd encourage everyone who's online to look at lots of the links which you've posted in the chat. There's lots of useful resources there that hopefully some of you will find interesting. Let me thank you all again, everyone who's viewing, so much for giving us all of your time this evening and listening to us talk about our research, which I know we all enjoyed very much. And I hope to see you all again sometime soon. Goodbye.